Hi, I'm Elly Hiby, the Scientific Coordinator for the ICAM Coalition and editor for this guide, Are We Making a Difference? A Guide to Monitoring and Evaluating DPM Interventions. It's the content of this guide that form the core of our Selecting and Measuring Indicators of DPM Impact workshop. I wanted to start by explaining where the idea for this guidance came from and its ambition. Some of you will be familiar with the ICAM Coalition, a coalition of international organisations, the logos of which you see on the slide. We came together in order to share our experiences of companion animal population management, both good and bad, and to learn from each other. We would share stories of DPM that was working and DPM that was failing, but we were conscious that we would often be sharing an anecdote with a real lack of objective data, and our definition of what success looked like, what working actually meant, would also often vary. And so we decided we needed to do better, and that we wanted to bring together the best of current innovations in M&E of DPM and also best practices from other fields, such as farm animal welfare and human development, to build a practical guidance on how to measure the impact of DPM. So what we have here is our best yet. We hope you will find it useful, and where you don't, or where you innovate further, please do let us know so that we may continue to improve this guidance in time. So the goal of the workshop today is to leave you feeling more confident about how to M&E your DPM interventions and how this guide can be used to help you do just that. I also want to share with you a particular street survey method of monitoring roaming dog population density, something quick and efficient, so it can be repeated regularly to get a measure of change over time. And we will achieve these goals by following these 5 steps. We're going to introduce some important concepts and terminology relating to monitoring and evaluation. We're going to work through Are We Making a Difference online interactive tool in smaller groups using hypothetical DPM interventions as examples. We're going to draft the start of an M&E plan using the outputs of the tool, and we're going to discuss how to make M&E happen in the real world. And then we're going to explore an efficient method of surveying roaming dog density. Now, I've used the term M&E, or monitoring and evaluation, a few times, just to define what I mean by that. Monitoring is the systematic and routine data collection measuring intervention progress and indicators of impact. So an example of monitoring intervention progress would be using veterinary clinic records to keep track of how many subsidised spays have been done per month. This is a measure of your intervention effort or output. Whilst an example of monitoring indicators of impact would include gathering data from hospitals on the number of dog bites recorded. This is the difference you are hoping to make with your intervention. An evaluation uses data collected through monitoring to answer questions about what difference does this intervention actually make. It can help you ask questions around efficiency and spot places or locations within your project geographical scope where things are going particularly well or perhaps not so well. It tends to be conducted regularly but not frequently, and it's also known as impact assessment. I would like to start by giving you reason to want to invest in monitoring and evaluation. What benefits can it bring? Well, it's very valuable to be able to show your donors the difference that their funding is having. The public, the citizens within your project area, will be interested to hear about the impacts of your intervention on them and their dogs, which together make up your beneficiary group. Sustainability is a common challenge to many of us, and having objective evidence of impact should help with lobbying to sustain an intervention. You may want to compare interventions using common indicators so you can make evidence-based decisions on what interventions should be used in future. But perhaps the most important is for the team that are running the DPM intervention to know if it's working, and if not, where and why, so that it can be evolved and improved upon. We can look at this in terms of a project cycle. So we start our intervention at the top of this cycle with population assessment to understand our dog population dynamics better. We can then plan our intervention to suit our community and our dogs, developing an M&E plan that will help us capture evidence of our impact. We then implement and monitor. At the orange evaluation stage is where we bring value from our monitoring by asking searching questions about how well our intervention is doing and what we have learned about our dogs and our community through our intervention implementation. This improves our understanding further, and we can then evolve our intervention and work back round the cycle. These loops or cycles may just take weeks or months in the early piloting stages, but it may well stretch to a number of years as the project matures. In its simplest terms, success depends on knowing what works. We need M&E to test whether we are making a difference or not, so that we can build on successes and improve where and when needed. So on this slide, we're going to build up definitions of some more terms we will be using today. An intervention is a set of activities, such as sterilisation of street dogs, education programmes in schools, or campaigns targeting specific dog owner behaviours, that together are working to achieve a stated aim. You may also term this a DPM project. Impacts are those changes that we hope to contribute towards using our interventions. Indicators are the measurable signs of those impacts, things we would see or hear if our desired impact was occurring. And methods of measurement are those techniques that we would use to measure our indicators. So different DPM interventions will have different impacts in mind, but we found that most fell into these 8 categories of impact, and these 8 provide the structure for our guidance. For each impact, we provide guidance on indicators that could be used to measure if that impact was indeed occurring. Now, most interventions target just 1 to 3 impacts. Let's take the first impact here of improving dog welfare and work through an example of the indicators and methods of measurement provided. So we recommend the indicator of body condition score because this indicator has been used previously by other DPM interventions in their monitoring and evaluation. We also give guidance on the indicator of dog-to-dog interactions. However, we describe this as suggested, because although changes in the level of friendly or aggressive behaviour has been used to assess the welfare of other animals, such as farm animals, it has yet to be tested with dogs in this DPM intervention scenario. And for each indicator, we also provide detailed practical advice on how you could measure data relating to that indicator. For example, in this photo you can see someone conducting a street survey of roaming dogs. He's using his smartphone to record the position, sex and visible welfare state of the dogs in front of him, and you can use this method of measurement to measure indicators such as body condition score. So here we have the 8 impacts, each with a list of potential indicators, each with at least one method of measurement. So the document is necessarily long, because it has to work for all the different DPM approaches that you may use and the different impacts that you may have in mind. So we've also developed an online tool that asks you a series of questions about your intervention and the dog population it's targeting. Based on your answers, the tool returns a tailored guidance document, including only those indicators and methods of measurement that appear suitable to you. It is this tool that we use in the next step of our workshop. At this stage of the workshop, delegates selected one of 3 scenarios. Now these are hypothetical scenarios, but they're based loosely or at least inspired by real-life DPM interventions. They picked one of the scenarios and then they worked through the online impact assessment tool with their facilitator. So I'll describe those 3 scenarios now. First of all, Kathmandu, which is the capital city of Nepal. They have a high density of roaming dogs, some with poor welfare, but many look relatively good and well fed. Many people feed dogs on the streets, not just their own dogs, but street dogs as well. They're very kind towards them, and some of those dogs do breed successfully. There are also many owned dogs in Kathmandu that are allowed to roam, and there is some level of abandonment. So based on that scenario, the local DPM system follows an authority-led process. So each local authority, which in Kathmandu is called a ward, takes responsibility for the DPM activities within that ward. They utilise teams of community volunteers, people who like dogs and work well with the community, and those community volunteers help the local ward authorities to sterilise and vaccinate community dogs, and those services are also offered to some owned animals. And every year they do a mass rabies vaccination campaign, again using the support of those community volunteers. And this is loosely based on Manamitra, which is a DPM intervention that you can hear more about if you listen to Sangeeta Sapkota's presentation, which was given at the same conference, and you can also find on the ICAM website. The second scenario is from Bali, which is an island in Indonesia. It was a rabies-free island until late 2008 when there was a rabies outbreak. This led to culling by the local authorities, and rabies spread quickly across the island. Many people and dogs died as a result. There's quite a high density of roaming dogs on Bali. Some of those dogs have quite poor welfare. There's very high dog ownership, and it's very common to allow your dog to roam. So when you see your dog on the street in Bali, most of the time, nearly all the time, that dog actually does have an owner. But abandonment is also common. So based on that scenario, the DPM intervention there was to utilise again community members that were trained up to change and inspire owner behaviour. They also used sterilisation and treatment events, veterinary treatment events for owned animals and community dogs. And also they support the annual government mass vaccination campaign. And this is loosely based on Programme Dharma, which is an intervention run by IFOR and BAWA, the Bali Animal Welfare Association, and the local university, and of course the local authorities as well. Our third scenario is from Jaipur in India. So the rabies risk there is quite high. There's a high density of roaming dogs, some of which have poor welfare. Many people feed dogs on the street, so some breed successfully, and there is a community dog population. And based on that scenario, the intervention there is a classic ABC or animal birth control intervention, as outlined in the Indian legislation. It involves catching of all entire street dogs. Females are prioritised for spaying and vaccination, adult males are vaccinated only, and young males are castrated and vaccinated. That is based on the assumption that the behaviour of adult males is somewhat learnt, and so castrating them may not really be worth the effort if your aim is to change their behaviour. However, young males that have not yet reached sexual maturity may well be worth castrating, because they may then not develop the sexual behaviour that can be considered a nuisance by local people. So that's why they have a difference in the castration targeting. And this scenario is loosely based on Help in Suffering's ABC intervention in Jaipur. If you'd like to hear more about that real life intervention, you can listen to Dr. Sanjay Singh's presentation, which was also given at the same conference, and you can find that on the ICAM website. So in the next section of the workshop, this was the facilitator-led group work. The delegates split themselves between those three scenarios, and then the facilitator described those scenarios in a bit more detail. Then in their groups, they worked through the online impact assessment tool, one impact at a time, answering all the questions until they got to the final summary of recommendations. They opened up that PDF and had a look at the guidance on each indicator and methods of measurement that were selected according to the answers that they gave when working through the online impact assessment tool. They repeated that for at least one more impact, or a maximum of 2. They then went back, chose an impact, and went back to the first page of the summary of recommendations and used the information in that PDF to fill in a monitoring and evaluation plan, which was displayed on a flip chart. They selected an indicator to start with, a method of measuring that indicator, and then they started to complete the other sections on frequency, budget, and imagining a lead person. So here's an example of the monitoring and evaluation plans that they filled in. And at the end of this group work, the facilitator fed back to the wider group and enjoyed the learnings from each group in a plenary session. So just a few final points here before we go on to the next section, which is looking in detail at the street survey methodology. And this is about how we make monitoring and evaluation a reality, not just an ambition or theory, and how we make it worthwhile and really useful. So the first is completing an M&E plan, as we just did in the group work, scoping out what monitoring actually looks like in terms of time and cost. This gives you the content that you might need for your organisation's action plan, for funding proposals, or maybe even for job objectives. Consider that lead person who's going to take responsibility for making sure that that indicator does indeed get measured. Now, we often don't have the resources, both in terms of time and money, to do all the relevant methods of measurement. And so it's often at this stage that we need to do a prioritisation. Now, when you do this, I suggest you start by ordering the indicators by priority, both for you and for your stakeholders, so you can begin to see what is essential and what is a nice to have. So this should narrow your focus on those monitoring, those methods of measurement that are going to produce you the most valuable data for those indicators that are considered a top shelf, top priority for all of your stakeholders. And my final point or suggestion is to plan and commit to evaluation events in advance. Set a date. Once a year is great, but it can be less frequent than that. Prepare to down tools, actually stop your day-to-day DPM work for at least a few days to look at the data produced by your monitoring. What does it tell you? What can you learn? What should you change? Now get this date into people's diaries well in advance. Promise to send a report on the event to important people like your donors, or indeed get them to come along, and make a commitment now. It will really help to make sure the monitoring does actually happen and it doesn't just drop off the to-do list, because people do get overwhelmed by their day-to-day DPM work. Okay, so in this next section of the workshop, we did something quite different. We did a sort of street survey game. So I'll try to describe how that worked for you now. So what we did here is lay out a map of Kathmandu, the capital city of Nepal. So drawn on that big white sheet that you see on the slide is a map including both residential roads and main roads. It has little areas of housing, little industrial areas and parks. And then what we did is pour onto that map, that representation of the centre of Kathmandu, a whole bunch of sweets of different colours. And those different colours meant different things. So the sweets are representing dogs living in the city. The green sweets were male, the yellows were female, the orange were adults of unknown sex. The red sweets were particularly important. Those were lactating females, and the purple sweets were dogs with visibly poor welfare. So they had either poor body condition or visible skin conditions, or both. So that map had drawn onto it 90 metres in total of street across that big white sheet, had 90 metres of street. But what was drawn onto that map was then a little yellow highlighted route, which included just 15 metres of street. And that little route, that highlighted route, was drawn to cover the different road types and building types in an approximately representative way. So the same proportions of main roads and residential streets appear in that highlighted 15 metres of route as you would see in the whole 90 metres of drawn town on this particular map. So we did a survey event along just that route. So I walked along the sheet counting all of the dogs that were inside the streets that were highlighted in yellow, counting a total of dogs. Another one of my facilitators followed exactly the same route and counted the total number of red sweets. Those are the lactating females. And then a second co-facilitator again followed behind, and she counted the total number of purple sweets. Those are dogs in poor welfare. Now we imagined that by moving the sweets around that we are now going into the following morning, and we did exactly the same survey protocol again. Walking along the streets, counting the total number of dogs, the total number of lactating females, and the total number of dogs with poor welfare. And that was to simulate the idea of replicating a survey the following morning to get an estimate of day-to-day variation in dog density. And then came the fun bit. We then imagined that we'd been running an intervention for the past year, and that it included sterilisation of owned and community dogs, basic veterinary treatment at a subsidised rate for owners and free for community dogs. And then I asked all of the delegates in the room to take 3 sweets off the map. They had to take one red one purple one, and one of any other colour. So they're simulating a reduction in dog density after a year's worth of intervention, and they're biasing that removal of dogs towards lactating females and dogs in poor welfare, on the assumption that the intervention would in particular reduce those particular types of dogs. So they lent in, took 3 dogs each, and then we ran the survey exactly the same way. So we went along the route, counting total dogs in those highlighted yellow streets, total number of lactating females, total number of dogs in poor welfare. Again, we did that twice. We then did another intervention. So again, all the delegates stepped in, took 3 sweets each, one red, one purple, and one of any other colour. And then we repeated both those surveys again. And then we did it a 3rd time. Again, the delegates reach in, take 3 dogs, and then we survey along the route twice. And between each survey, we're just redistributing the sweets across the map to show that the dogs move back into their areas. And then we take that data and we put that up on a graph that was in the room with us, and it looked something like this. So what we have here is 3 different data points. We have the total number of dog sightings in black, the total number of red sweets or lactating females here in red, the total number of purple sweets or dogs with poor welfare here. And we have 3 survey events on the x-axis, and at each survey event we have 2 data points. So these are the 2 replica surveys that we ran, imagining that we were just doing the surveys on 2 consecutive days. And then we have these 3 survey events, and in between each survey event is the year's worth of intervention, and during that time we assume that the dog population has reduced, in particular lactating females and those with poor welfare, because our intervention included reproduction control and veterinary care. And so our delegates had in particular removed lactating females and those with poor welfare. And so that when we go to the 2nd survey event, we clearly counted fewer dogs on our survey routes, and fewer both lactating females and dogs with poor welfare. And then between survey event 2 and 3, we again simulated a year's worth of intervention by removing 3 sweets per delegate, and again we got a reduction in the total number of dogs seen on the route and the reduction in lactating females and dogs with poor welfare. So obviously this is example data, pretend data created through the Sweetie game. But we also have some real data to show. So here is some data from Bali in Indonesia. So that was the scenario 2 that the delegates worked with. And this is a particular desa called Sanur Kaja. That desa or village is comprised of 8 sub-villages, and you can see that each of the sub-villages are named here. They're also called banjars. And we had a survey route in each one of these sub-villages. And we have 3 survey events here, at least 6 months apart. And at each survey event, they replicated the survey usually on 3 occasions to get a measure of day-to-day variation. Here is another example. This time this is data from Puerto Rico. These are 4 different municipalities in Puerto Rico. Again, they had 1 route per municipality. They've run 4 survey events here, and each time they have run the survey on 2 consecutive days to get a measure of day-to-day variation, and then of course this change in dog density over time. And this is just representing the total number, the number of dogs they observed per mile of street surveyed. The importance of running these replica routes, these replica surveys, is that you want to have a look at whether the variation in the dog numbers from day to day is greater than or less than the variation in dog density over time. And this is when we talk about statistical significance, we're comparing the difference day to day with the difference over time and asking the question, is the change in dog density over time greater or less than the variation we would expect day to day? And in this case, they saw a significant reduction in roaming dogs per mile over time. Okay, so we're out on our survey and we want to observe a dog on the street. What do we record? Well, that will depend to a certain extent on which indicators you've selected for measuring your impact. But what I have here is the variables or the fields that I have found work quite well for measuring several key indicators. So every time I see a dog in front of me, I am recording its type, which is a combination of both its sex and also its sterilisation or its breeding status. Is it lactating or is it sterilised? I also record body condition score. That's just visibly. No, it doesn't require a clinical exam. You're just having a look at the body condition on a 5-point scale. I look at skin condition, again just visible, not clinical exams, just the presence or absence of a skin condition. And if this survey is occurring following an intervention that involves marking, such as a mass vaccination campaign, I'm also recording whether that dog is marked or not by the collar or paint. So regardless what you want to record, you need to decide how you're going to record it. So recording observations of dogs can be done just with paper forms, followed by transcription into Excel or a database such as an Access database or Google Sheets. But there are options of using phone apps, so these are mobile phone applications. I use a combination of OSM Tracker and an Access database. ICAM is currently investing in an app for surveying street dogs, which will be available in 2020. And you will also hear about other apps at this conference, including apps from Humane Society International, WVS, and also Animal ID. So there are other options out there. Whichever recording method you choose, it's important to keep your methodology clear and consistent to ensure your data is as robust and error-free as possible. So you're trying to reduce what is called confounding variables. So always choose the same route and therefore take time about planning your route at the outset. Stick to the exact same time of day. We know that dogs change their roaming behaviour based on how people behave, and we know that people behave differently depending on the time of day. Always use the same mode of transport. You can drive if you like, or you can walk, but I find that cycling or having two people on a motorbike works better because it's easier to stop and observe the dog clearly, but it's also quite a fast way to move through. Now we know that you are going to have a different sighting probability, so your chance of seeing roaming dogs will differ with the way in which you're transporting yourself along the route. So choose the mode of transport that works for you and then stick to it. Keep the same observers if you can to avoid inter-observer differences, or ensure that if you have got a change in observers, ensure that there is a training period or a handover period so that they can maintain the same protocol. Know that the seasons may change dog density because breeding may be seasonal. So for example, in Rajasthan, in the scenario 3 in Jaipur that they discussed in their groups, they have very strong seasonal breeding with a peak of breeding at the end of November. So do use the same time of year, and if you're using different times of year, try to compare like with like. So compare your autumn surveys to your next year's autumn surveys. Do not compare autumn to spring and expect them to be a measure of just change in density. They may be measuring a difference in seasonal density as well. Also avoid unusual days. So bad weather. If it's raining, don't go out because the dogs won't be going out either. Also avoid days of unusual human activity. So market days or public holidays are well worth avoiding. Dogs will change their behaviour in response to both the weather and what people are doing. So we want to reduce as possible these other confounding variables which are going to change your dog density. So keeping all these things consistent will minimise those confounding variables and improve the validity of your data. I want to talk very briefly about designing your route. So in the previous slide, I mentioned sticking to a standard route. So you better design a good one at baseline because this is going to be resurveyed for many years. Now the route that I drew in that Kathmandu example that we used in the Sweetie game was unbiased with regards to roaming dogs, and it was representative with regards to different road types and building types. But we know that dogs don't act like this. So they often appear in clusters, small groups. They have their favourite spots, places with resources such as food and sleeping places and tolerance from people. So once you've clustered the dogs, you can see that there are portions of the route where there are no or very few dogs, and surveying those is potentially considered a waste of our limited time. We know we're very unlikely to see dogs in some areas because that's just not where dogs hang out. So one alternative way to design your route is to create what we're calling a hotspot route. You need knowledge of how dogs cluster in your location. So ask people locally, where are the hotspots for roaming dogs? And they'll show you graveyards and bus depots and parks and so on. And then you create a route that travels from hotspot to hotspot in the most efficient way. This should create a route that is the most sensitive to changes in your dog population because it allows you to observe the highest proportion of the roaming dogs within your limited survey window. One downside is that the dogs per kilometre you get from a hotspot route cannot be extrapolated up to an estimate of total roaming dog population. And I'm going to go back to our data from an unbiased representative route to give you an example of what I mean by this. So here is our data from the Kathmandu example, and we're going to use this data to estimate the total number of roaming dogs in Kathmandu at the time of surveying, and that's an important qualifier. So we're going to use this data now. So we're going to take the total number of roaming dogs from our first survey event. So that's before any of the interventions, also known as sweetie eating, happened. So we look at these two data points here. That's the total number of dogs seen on the route at the first survey event on the two replicates. So what we want is an average of these two numbers. So this is 90, this is 85, add them together and divide by 2, and we get an average of 87.5 dogs seen on the route during the first survey. Now our route on this particular map, our little example of Kathmandu, our route was 15 metres long. So we're going to divide that 87.5 by 15, and we get 5.8 dogs per metre of route surveyed. I'm working in metres here because we're talking about the example where we had the big map on the floor. Now obviously normally you'd work in kilometres or miles, but for this example we're going to work in metres. So we have 5.8 roaming dogs per metre on our route, but we know that there is a total of 90 metres of street in that little Kathmandu map. So we're going to multiply 5.8 by 90, and we get 525 roaming dogs on our Kathmandu streets at the time of surveying, and that's the important qualifier. Now I know there were nearly 800 dogs on our map when we first surveyed, so where did the others go? Well, they weren't on the street. They were inside a house if they were owned roaming, or in a park or factory grounds if they were unowned. We know that when we survey, we are always missing a proportion of the total roaming dog population. Our estimates show that we tend to miss around a half, but this does vary with dog behaviour. in particular if a large proportion of your roaming dog population is owned roaming, as they will spend a large proportion of their time at home. And if your project happens in a built-up city, you are likely to see a higher proportion of your roaming dogs, as they have limited spaces to hide. They have to be on the street. One way to maximise the proportion of roaming dogs that you see is to survey when roaming dogs are most active. This is often early in the morning before traffic gets heavy. What we estimate by multiplying the dogs per kilometre by total street length, or dogs per metre by total street length, as in our little example of the map, is the total number of dogs roaming on the street at the time of the survey. It doesn't include those dogs that can roam but weren't roaming when we surveyed. We only see a proportion of the total number of dogs that ever roam. Calculating this proportion is difficult. This is sometimes called a detectability estimate. It requires much more intensive survey effort, usually using mark recapture methods, which are covered in the ICAM guide in Annex D. But rather than spend extra time doing mark recite experiments, which are time consuming and fraught with difficulties and assumptions that may not hold true, my recommendation to you is this: forget total estimates as far as you can and instead focus on density. And this is for 3 reasons. 1, surveying to measure density is quick and easy. It takes about an hour to survey 10 kilometres, which may well be plenty to get a reliable measure. In comparison, a reliable estimate of total population, including correcting for detectability, may take several days, if not weeks. 2, I feel that density is actually more meaningful. Tell someone that lives in a town that there are 640 dogs that live here. So what? It doesn't really mean very much, but if you tell him that there are 4 dogs per kilometre, it's not a big step to translate that into the number of dogs that he may meet on his 10-kilometre commute to work, 40 dogs on average, or the number of dogs his child meets on their 2-kilometre walk to school, 8 dogs on average. So reduce the density of dogs and you change his experience of living in this city. And finally, towns and cities grow. So for example, Jaipur grew by 50% in 10 years. Now, in that same time period, the ABC programme reduced density by over a quarter, by nearly a third. This reduction in density was noted by local people. They perceived there to be less roaming dogs. But if they'd measured the ABC programme by using a total estimate, the population may well have actually grown in total number. The city was much bigger, the resources had multiplied, there were more people with more dogs, there were more people to feed roaming dogs, and so there were more dogs within that growing boundary of what became Jaipur over that 10-year period. So my recommendation is to create a hotspot route and survey this regularly to see how the density of roaming dogs, lactating females and welfare is changing over time. And if you're marking dogs during sterilisation, then also record the percentage of marked dogs and how that is changing, because this is a measure of your intervention effort or output. It's super simple and it takes relatively little time to do. Now, if you're forced to come up with an estimate, and I do understand the ambition to uncover this, what may be called a magic number, try doing one single survey along an unbiased, representative route at a time of day when roaming dogs are most visible, and then multiply the dogs per kilometre by the total street length in your project area. Be sure that when you quote this number, you state that this is an estimate of the total dog population roaming on public streets at the time of the survey. It's not the total population of dogs that ever roam. You can consider this a minimum estimate. You know you have at least this many roaming dogs in your project area. This may feel a little frustrating to not have a really good estimate of that magic number, but it is a low-cost way of achieving an objective best estimate. Okay, and that brings me to the end of the workshop. I want to be clear that the guidance that we developed is not a set of rules, doesn't describe a set of standard indicators that we all must follow. What we've done is collate our best yet. This field of monitoring and evaluation in DPM is in its infancy, so we found those inspirational leaders in the field and learned from their experience. And further, we have selected those approaches that are most resource efficient in recognition of the limited resources that we tend to be working with. I hope you'll feel inspired to put this guidance into action, including testing some of the suggested approaches. Please do share your experiences with us so this guidance can evolve over time, thanks to its own M&E. You can contact us through the email address or speak to representatives of the ICAM members. And when it comes to the street surveys, please go out there, give them a try. They shouldn't be hugely time consuming and they should give you some really valuable data. Thank you.